You'd marry her?
Orrin Colton's voice cracked against the ceiling of his parlor like a whip finding wood.
The one who smells like horse and lamp oil? You came to court my daughter. Court that one.
Slade Fenwick didn't flinch. He stood near the fireplace with his hat in both hands and his eyes on Adah Colton, who had gone perfectly still near the doorway to the kitchen, a dish towel folded over one wrist, her face blank with something that looked more like bracing for impact than genuine surprise. She was waiting for him to take it back. He didn't. Before any of that, there was an October morning 3 days earlier, cold enough to see your breath, and Adah was already at the trading post counter before sunup, working through the month's supply ledger while the rest of the household slept. The kerosene lamp threw a small circle of light over columns of figures. She worked in pencil, never ink, because figures had a way of being wrong on the first pass, and she'd learned not to trust anything she couldn't correct. The Colton trading post sat at the south edge of Darro, New Mexico territory, where the railroad spur had come through 2 years prior and brought with it the specific kind of chaos that followed a sleepy cattle town deciding it was grown up.
New faces, new money, new debt. Mostly debt in the Colton family's case.
Orrin Colton had borrowed against the trading post to build the house, then borrowed against the house to stock the trading post, then borrowed against both to keep his cattle operation alive through the drought of '87. He was a man who had confused motion for progress for so long that he no longer knew where his actual money ended and Jasper Fenwick's money began. Jasper Fenwick owned the Territorial Bank of Darro. He owned several other things besides, but the bank was the thing that mattered to the Coltons.
Adah knew all of this because she kept the books.
Had kept them since she was 17 and caught the accounting error that would have bankrupted them a full year ahead of schedule. Her father had never thanked her for finding it. He had just handed her the ledger and told her not to lose it.
That was the arrangement, unspoken and total. Adah kept everything running,
and Orrin kept pretending everything ran itself. Her younger sister Esther Colton came downstairs at 8 o'clock, dressed for company, though company wasn't expected until evening. Esther was 23 and genuinely beautiful in a way that required almost no effort, which their mother had decided was a sign of destiny rather than plain good fortune. The girl had been trained for it: piano lessons, French conversation, the particular art of sitting in a chair as though the chair had been built specifically to display her.
"Is the good china washed?"
Esther asked, not looking at the ledger. "Yes."
"And you'll stay in the back tonight?" Adah didn't look up from her columns. "That's the plan. Father says Mr. Fenwick is bringing his son."
Esther smoothed her skirt and checked her reflection in the dark window glass.
"He's supposed to be very impressive." "I'm sure he is. You could at least change your shirt." "I'm working."
Esther looked at her sister with something between pity and impatience, the exact expression she'd worn since childhood when she couldn't decide whether to feel sorry for Adah or embarrassed by her. She left without another word, and Adah went back to the ledger. Slade Fenwick arrived with his father at 6 in the evening, and the first thing he did, before introductions, before handshakes, before Orrin finished his nervous laugh about the weather, was notice that someone had repaired the broken hinge on the trading post door. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that went unnoticed unless you were paying attention to what was real versus what was performance.
The hinge had a new bolt, recently oiled, set flush and even. Careful work.
The parlor had been arranged for a show. Esther sat in the best chair in the amber lamplight, wearing a deep burgundy dress that cost more than the family's monthly flower supply. Orrin wore his wedding coat, brushed clean. Nance Colton hovered near the good china with the specific anxiety of a woman running a theater production that depended on everyone staying in their assigned roles. Jasper Fenwick was exactly what Slade had expected:
Precise, cold.
The kind of man who turned every social occasion into a transaction and had long since stopped noticing he was doing it. He had been building alliances through marriages, contracts, and the quiet leverage of knowing everyone's debt for 30 years. Slade went through the motions. He shook Orrin's hand, nodded to Esther, sat where he was shown, made the required observations about the house and the weather. He was halfway through his second cup of coffee when he heard the back door open and close, and then heard the particular sound of someone working a supply count. The steady rhythm of a person who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't need to think about it. He excused himself, said he needed air. Orrin looked alarmed. Esther's smile tightened. Jasper said nothing. He found Adah in the back storeroom, tallying crates of salt pork by lantern light, her coat still on from outside, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She didn't hear him at first. He watched her for a moment. The efficiency of it, the total absence of performance. When she finally looked up, she didn't startle. She just looked at him with gray eyes that were already calculating what his presence meant and deciding not to care. "You're in the wrong part of the house," she said.
I know. Esther's in the parlor. I know that, too. She went back to her count, lips moving slightly.
He looked around the storeroom, the organization of it, everything labeled, stacked by weight, the inventory sheet tacked to the wall in handwriting that was small and precise.
This yours?
He asked.
The storeroom? The whole operation, the books, the supply orders, the inventory.
She paused. Who's asking?
Someone who's spent 4 years watching his father buy ranches that failed
Because nobody kept honest books. Adah set down her count sheet and looked at him fully for the first time.
She was around 28, with a face that didn't worry about first impressions because it had other things to do. Her hands were rough-knuckled, her hair pinned back without ceremony. Your father's bank holds our note, she said. I know.
Then you know why I won't say anything too interesting to you.
Say it anyway. She almost laughed, not quite, but almost.
The dinner went the way those dinners always went. Esther was charming. Oren was ingratiating. Jasper navigated the conversation with the satisfaction of a man watching his own plan execute on schedule. Slade sat through 3 courses and kept thinking about the woman in the storeroom who'd looked at him like he was a variable she hadn't finished solving. On the second day, he asked to see the trading post operation, the supply contracts, the freight schedule, the pricing structure. Oren agreed immediately. Adah showed him everything with the manner of someone who expected the tour to end in politeness and nothing more.
She was wrong about that.
By noon, Slade had read enough to understand that the Colton trading post was not a failing business. It was a profitable one being bled dry by a loan structure designed to guarantee it could never get ahead. He recognized the architecture of it because he had watched his father draft similar terms before.
He didn't say that. Not yet.
But Adah watched his face while he read the loan document, and afterward they were both quiet for a long time.
You already knew, he said. I suspected.
She took the document back and filed it where it belonged. You can't prove something like this without access to every other loan your father holds. I only have ours. How long have you known? 3 years of reading the same numbers and arriving at the same answer.
She closed the file, long enough to know we won't dig out under these terms, not long enough to do anything about it.
He came back the 3rd day with the intention of making his position plain.
What followed in the parlor was not quiet. You'd marry her?
Oren's face had gone the deep red of a man watching everything he'd planned slide out of reach.
Esther is the arrangement. Esther is what this family has prepared for this moment.
Esther sat in the burgundy chair with her hands folded in her lap, and for once her face showed something unmanaged, a complicated grief, half-wounded pride, and half something that looked almost like relief, and she didn't seem to know what to do with either. Jasper said nothing at all, which was worse than if he'd raged.
Adah stood in the kitchen doorway and waited.
Oren turned on her with the full weight of everything collapsing. Tell him no.
Tell him this isn't what we discussed. Tell him the arrangement is for Esther.
The old Adah, the one who had learned to keep her head down, her mouth shut, and her ledgers accurate, would have said yes, father, would have called it practical, would have told herself that some choices weren't hers to make.
She looked at Slade. He didn't look away. No, she said. Oren went still. If Mr. Fenwick wants to marry me, I accept.
Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. 28 years of keeping this family solvent with no credit and no acknowledgement. I'm done refusing opportunities so other people can take what they're supposed to have.
You ungrateful. I'm the most grateful person in this room.
She folded the dish towel over the counter with the same deliberateness she gave everything. I'm grateful I know how to work. I'm grateful I'm not afraid of what the numbers say. And I'm grateful that someone finally asked my opinion about my own life. Nance Colton had not moved from her position near the window. She was a small woman who had made herself smaller with each passing year of her marriage, and she stood now with her hands clasped and her eyes wet, and then she said quietly, "She's right."
Everyone turned. Oren.
Nance's voice carried the weight of a woman who had spent decades choosing silence and had only recently calculated the full cost of that choice.
We've used her, both of us. We've worked her like hired help we didn't have to pay, and I've allowed it, and I am ashamed.
She looked at Adah with the complicated love of someone who had arrived late but arrived nonetheless. If she wants to go, she goes with my blessing, whatever that's worth.
The silence that followed had the particular quality of something irreversible. Jasper picked up his hat. The Fenwick property outside Darro was the kind of place designed to tell you how much it cost before you'd gotten through the gate. Wide grounds, a house with a high portico, horses in the paddock that were individually worth more than most families earned in 2 years. Adah arrived by wagon the next morning with one trunk and the composure of someone who had already decided not to be unsettled by things that could be purchased. Jasper was on the porch. "My son," he said, when they'd come up the steps, "has made a decision I find difficult to respect. I want you to know that plainly." "I appreciate plain speaking," Adah said. "You are not what this family requires for where it's going." "You may be right." She looked at him without flinching. "But I'm what your son chose, so we'll find out together." Jasper stepped aside. It was not the same as welcoming her in, but it was functionally the same thing. The first 2 weeks were a careful battle conducted at low volume. Jasper made it understood through every small ceremony of the household that Adah was provisional, her opinions unrequested at dinner, her presence in business discussions unremarked upon, her knowledge treated as beside the point by a man who had spent 30 years confident he was the most capable person in any room he entered. Adah was accustomed to being underestimated. She had built an entire operational knowledge of the Colton trading post in the spaces between being dismissed. She did the same thing here. She asked Marta, who had kept the Fenwick household for 11 years, about the filing system. She spent evenings in the library reading the territorial land records Jasper kept in bound volumes organized by year. She didn't make a show of it, she just read. What she found took 4 days to believe and 2 more to verify. Jasper Fenwick had been manipulating foreclosure timelines. Not illegally, technically, the method was sophisticated enough to remain just inside what the territorial courts would uphold. He would extend loan terms by 30 days through a procedural courtesy, which reset the default clock, which then allowed him to require additional collateral that most struggling ranchers couldn't provide, which triggered a modified foreclosure. He had done it to 11 properties in 6 years. 7 of those properties were now Fenwick-owned. The Colton note carried the identical structure, different numbering, same architecture. She sat with the documents for a long time. Then she brought them to Slade. He read them at the kitchen table while the lamp burned low and the October wind worked at the windows. His face moved through disbelief, recognition, anger, and then a grief that was specific to understanding your inheritance. "He was doing this to your family," Slade said. "To 11 families I can trace. Ours would have been the 12th. You're certain about the mechanism?" "I've been reading loan documents since I was 17. She held his gaze. "I'm certain." He was quiet for a long time. "If we take this to the territorial court, it ends everything he's built. It ends everything built on this. What's actually his, he keeps. He'll fight us. He has judges, lawyers, 20 years of favors." "He does." Adah gathered the documents carefully. "But he has a son who won't look the other way. He doesn't account for that." They found Jasper the next morning in his office. He was reviewing cattle prices when they came in. He read both their faces in a single second, the particular skill of a man who had survived by understanding what people intended before they moved, and he set down his pen very carefully. "Show me," he said. Slade laid the documents on the desk. Jasper read through them with the stillness of someone containing a reaction too large to put on his face. When he finished, he aligned the edges and set them down and looked at the far wall for a moment. "These are legal instruments," he said. "They're built to appear legal," Adah said. "That is not the same as honest. Business in this territory." 7 families lost land that was theirs. Slade waited until his father looked at him directly. The Marchetti family worked their property for 22 years. Their sons were born on it. A silence settled in the room and stayed. "The Colton note," Adah said. "You were going to take the trading post within 60 days. My father doesn't know the mechanism has already been set in motion. He thinks he's behind on interest payments." Jasper's jaw moved once. "You came here to destroy me." "We came here to stop you from doing any more of it." Slade's voice was controlled in the way that meant it had cost something to make it so. "What you built honestly, what you earned fairly, that's yours. That's real. But you don't keep what you took through a scheme." "It wasn't a..." "You know it was," Adah said it simply. "That's why you built it complicated enough to defend in court instead of simple enough to explain at a dinner table." The longest silence of her life filled that office. Jasper looked at his son.
Then he looked at the woman his son had chosen over every other option set before him, and he looked at her for a long time with something that had no clean name. "What is it you want?" he said at last.
Full restitution for the 7 foreclosures, Adah said. Fair market compensation for the land and improvements taken.
The Colton note restructured at honest terms.
And you stop. She let that sit for a moment. Whatever else you are, and you've built something real here, whatever you used to do it, you stop. This will cost me nearly half of what I hold. Then you'll hold half as much, and every acre of it will be yours without condition. You believe that matters.
I believe you have a son who chose a woman who reads ledgers over one who plays piano,
Adah said, because he is trying hard not to become you.
That should matter. Maybe not tonight, but in 10 years, when he has children of his own, it will. Something moved through Jasper's expression that had been buried a long time. Old grief, the kind that had calcified into ambition and stopped being examined.
My wife,
he said quietly enough that Adah nearly missed it. She told me something similar, 20 years ago. Said I was constructing something I'd be ashamed of in the end. He paused. I told her she didn't understand how business worked in this territory.
Did she understand it? More than I credited her for.
His voice had gone dry. She understood that a thing built wrong will come apart eventually. She simply couldn't have known which woman would be holding the documentation when it did. He looked at the papers one final time. I'll need 30 days, he said, to organize the restitution properly, to do it without destroying every legitimate relationship I've built along with the fraudulent ones.
We'll be here,
Slade said.
I don't want lawyers managing the calculations. Jasper looked at Adah. I want you. If I'm doing this, it will be done correctly.
It was the closest thing to a compliment he knew how to give. What followed was not simple. The restitution took 4 months rather than 30 days because the legal structure Jasper had built required careful dismantling. Twice he tested smaller numbers. Twice Adah sat across from him with the original land records and the compound arithmetic of 2 decades of fair use, and she didn't move. The third time he didn't try. You are going to be expensive, Jasper said one evening when they'd finished a difficult session and the fire had burned to coals. Honest accounting tends to be, Adah said. He almost smiled, not warmly, but with a kind of recognition that was something. Esther arrived in December, brought by their mother in a wagon on a gray afternoon. She had turned down 2 more arrangements their father proposed after Adah left, one to an elderly land speculator, one to a dry goods distributor who needed a wife in roughly the same way he needed a company seal. Esther arrived thinner and steadier than she had been, with her hair pinned back practically and her hands fidgeting with nothing because she'd stopped reaching for things to arrange. I don't know what I'm actually good at, she told Adah the first evening, sitting in the kitchen where it was warm. I know what I was trained for. I don't know if any of it is useful.
You read people, Adah said. You always could. You knew things about father's moods that I missed because I was looking at the ledger. Esther considered that. That doesn't seem like a skill. It is one. It just hasn't been called one.
Jasper put Esther to work in the correspondence office, where the volume of letters arriving from territorial officials and land assessors had grown beyond what anyone had anticipated. She proved careful, precise, better with people than Adah in exactly the ways Adah had named. Within 6 weeks, Jasper was consulting her on how to phrase difficult letters to men whose land he was returning.
He never commented on this. He simply kept doing it.
Adah Colton came in January not entirely to make peace, but because the trading post needed a supply contract renewed, and he couldn't negotiate it without Adah's notes on the previous year's pricing, which she had taken with her when she left. He found her in the Fenwick accounts office, which had been her domain for 2 months by then. He stood in the doorway, looking smaller than she remembered. The contract, he said.
I know. She had already pulled the file and handed it across. He took it and didn't leave.
Your mother worries, he said after a moment.
She knows where I am.
That's not, he stopped, started again. She says I owe you an apology.
Adah waited.
I don't know how to give one properly. He said it without deflection, which surprised her. I don't know how to say I used something without admitting I understood what I was using.
Then don't say it that way.
She turned back to her work. Come at Christmas, bring Mama.
Don't come with a scheme and don't make it a negotiation. Just come.
He left without answering. He came at Christmas, and he brought Nance. He sat at the Fenwick table with the bewilderment of a man who had misread every hand he was dealt for 30 years, and was only now beginning to read the other faces in the room correctly. Jasper and Adah did not like each other.
But they recognized each other, which was a different thing, and in the end more useful. The wedding was in March, when the territory was beginning to remember what color looked like after winter. Small and deliberate, held on the front porch of the Fenwick house where the land spread to the horizon under a sky that couldn't decide between blue and gold and chose both. Jasper gave the toast. It was short, which was a mercy, and it carried more weight in what it left out than in what it said. That he had not built the thing he intended to build, and that perhaps what stood now, smaller and harder and more honestly earned, would prove better for lasting. Nance cried. Esther held her hand and didn't. After the guests had gone and the fire had burned down to coals, Adah stood on the porch with Slade and looked out over land that had been redrawn that year. Some of it returned to families who had stopped expecting to see it again. Some of it still Fenwick ground, but held now without condition, because what remained was actually theirs. Your father said something to me before the ceremony, Slade said. What? Said he'd spent a year deciding whether to fight you or trust you. He chose trust because fighting you was more expensive. He looked at her sideways. He meant it as a compliment. I know, Adah smiled. That's how he talks. They stood there in the dark together, the New Mexico night spreading wide and indifferent over land that had seen fraud and restitution, and the slow, unglamorous work of making something honest from the remains of something that wasn't. It wasn't a perfect thing. It was a built thing, which was harder and considerably more durable, and Adah Colton had always known the difference between the two. She had always known.